John chapter 17. We'll have our text in John chapter 17. Our world has a lot to say about coping. They talk about coping mechanisms or coping strategies or ways to cope with various problems. There are a lot of social problems in our world, and even to our little children, we find difficulties in coping with various problems. There's a lot of talk these days about bullying. Little children facing bullies, and even adults claiming that they face this kind of behavior in the workplace. It was nothing new, there's just a lot of talk about it. There were bullies all along. You think about Goliath and what he did to God's people. He was quite the bully, wasn't he? There's a lot of problems that we need to cope with in our world. There are people that struggle with addiction, and they have to have coping strategies to deal with their temptation to what they're addicted to. In John chapter 17, this was the night before Jesus was to die on the cross. And Jesus gives us, in his prayer, his desire for us to be able to cope, for us to be able to deal with what we're facing in this world. This was a prayer between himself as the Son of God and his Father in heaven. And I'd like us to read a portion of his prayer. And remember, this is the night before he was crucified. You think about what you would pray for if you knew you were going to die by execution the next day. What would you be praying for? Jesus prayed for others. In John 17, beginning with verse 14, he said, I have given them, that is, talking about his disciples, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I also have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, that they also may be sanctified by the truth. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be one in us, that the world may believe that you sent me. Isn't that a marvelous prayer between Jesus and his Father? Did you catch it? He not only prayed for his disciples that were living then, he prayed for you. He prayed for me. Did you see it there? He said in verse 20, I do not pray for these, that is, these disciples that were with him. I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. How did we believe in Jesus? We had to have information to know about Jesus and to accept by faith. This information came through the word that they received. John 16:13, the Holy Spirit guided these disciples into all truth. When we read what they wrote down, we believe on Jesus through their word. And Jesus said, I pray not for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. So he's praying for you. He's praying for me. Did you notice how many times he talked about us being in this world? We have to cope with living in this world. I'd like to speak to you today about how to live in the world and yet not be worldly. How to live in the world and not be worldly. I want us to encourage one another as God's people to live victoriously. Brother Bill taught in our class this morning from Revelation, his emphasis on the word overcoming. We have to overcome things in this life, things like temptation, sin, trial, testing, pain, suffering, so we want to encourage one another as God's people to live victoriously. When you analyze Jesus' prayer, you see what was important to him the night before he died. You know, you can use that same analysis on yourself. If you analyze your prayers, you'll find out real quickly what's really important to you. Because you pray about those things that really mean the most to you. And Jesus was praying about you and I, and we are involved in this prayer, and Jesus is praying about the inevitable problem that we all face. And that is, we face this world head on. The world, what is it? Well, it identifies here mankind separated from God because of sin and controlled by the devil. 2 Corinthians 4, verses 4 and 5, the devil is called the God, little g, of this world because he's dominating the minds of men through his influence and through getting them to rebel against the truth of God. Well, in this prayer, we see what's important to Jesus, and he tells us how we can live in the world and yet not be worldly. So I'd like us to consider two things. Number one, some so-called human solutions. They're not really solutions, but they're human strategies or mechanisms to cope with living in this world. And from a religious standpoint, many have tried many things to cope with this world and try not to be worldly. But if they're human, they are inevitable that they will fail. Inevitably, they will fail because they have a human source, and humans are weak, and we're not very wise compared to the wisdom of God. So I'd like us to look at a few of these things. Before we look at the religious so-called solutions, we could quickly look at what the world does to just cope with this world. They may not be trying not to be worldly, but they're trying to cope with the world. And so we see the rise of drugs and alcohol abuse. I heard recently that some of our leaders in this city are wanting Huntsville to be known as the craft brewery center of the South, if not everywhere. And they're popping up everywhere. Former schools are now breweries in this town. Well, what are they brewing? They're brewing alcohol. What does alcohol do? Well, if you get down to it, ethyl alcohol is a poison. It's not made for humans to consume. But people consume things that weren't made for them to consume, and it has ill effects. Of course, we've known the ills of alcohol abuse through the centuries, all the way back to when Noah got drunk. We see what happened to him. And we're warned about these things, and yet the world tries to escape through these avenues of numbing the mind or the judgment, or escaping through drugs, alcohol, entertainment, you name it, the world tries escapism. And some will even use religion that way, just to escape into a religious, emotional euphoria and try to forget everything. But we find that in the world of religion, religion has been used as a way to come up with human solutions to the problem of coping with the world. Let me name a few of them. Isolation. You ever seen a monastery or read about them? This was something that became very popular in the past, in the centuries long ago. They would get a group of priests or a group of monks and put them off to themselves, maybe in a desert. There is a monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai, St. Catherine's Monastery, been there since the 4th century. And people sequester themselves away. They isolate themselves because they think that they can get away from the world and therefore not be worldly. Some people even segregate the sexes so that they can prevent immorality. Put the monks over here, the men, and put the nuns over here, and get them separated as somehow to prevent the problems of worldliness. Some even take vows of poverty so that they can cure their greed. They say, I'll just have no material things, therefore I won't be greedy. Some take vows of silence. Why? Well, they want to cope with the problems of gossip and lying and misuse of the tongue. So they take a vow of silence. Just won't say anything. Therefore, I won't sin with the tongue. But here's the problem. If a person gets away from the world, either by not talking or by taking a vow of poverty and acting like worldly things are not important at all, or segregating themselves, the men over here, the women over here are just getting away from the world out in a desert or a mountaintop. The problem with that is Jesus wanted us to be in the world but not be of the world. He said his disciples are to be like salt in a tasteless world, or light in a dark world. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 14 through 16, he said, let your light so shine among men that they may see your good works, glorify your Father which is in heaven. And we are to be like salt in this world. Salt has a preservative effect. It also has, it adds taste, and it just makes a difference. You can tell when the salt's been taken out of your diet. And so with light. If you're in darkness, you're looking for light. This world needs both. And if Christians pull away from the world is left without the good influence Jesus wants us to have on the world and in the world. And then we look at the idea of mutilation, where a person would physically harm their own body. And Jesus made some statements like that. He said, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. Or if your right hand offends you, cut it off. Or if your foot offends you, cut it off. Was he talking literal mutilation? There have been some who took Jesus literal there and they actually mutilated their body in order to conform. But Jesus was talking about the heart. You see, our heart motivates the body what it does, the mind. And so if we have a problem with lust, we don't literally pluck out our eye. We control the eye by not looking at those things which arouse lust. Or Jesus said, if we are sinning and offending with our hand, cut it off. Well, what's the problem with the hand? Well, sometimes it can do evil. It can pick up a knife or a gun, or it can steal. What did Paul say? He said, let him who stole steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands. You may have to give to him who has need. So there's a proper use of the hand. So cut it off as far as stealing is concerned. Cut it off toward murder. Cut it off to doing harmful things. Use your hands to do good, your eyes to do good, and your feet to go to the right places. Don't let your feet take you to the wrong places. Let your feet be cut off to the places a Christian does not belong. But people have tried to harm their bodies in order to conform with the problems of the world, even to the point where there have been some who have emasculated themselves to try to cope with temptation, but that's not what Jesus was talking about. Then deprivation of the body. Colossians 2:23 talk about those who would practice asceticism or deprive their body through neglect, starve themselves. Some would point to Jesus where he fasted for 40 days so that he was in the desert to be tempted by the devil. But notice, Jesus did not fast in order to cope with the devil. The devil didn't come to him until after he had fasted and was very weak, and that's when the devil attacked. So starving ourselves is not a way to deal with the world. Now, here's the one that we all get caught up in. Probably our problem is not becoming a monk or a nun or isolated in a monastery or mutilating our body or depriving our body, as some have done. And I'm not questioning their sincerity, but those things are not necessary. There's another thing.